so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers, the Mobile Tartu conference I've heard about for many, many years and always wanted to come, so it's a pleasure to be here finally. I'm going to be, as we said, speaking about mobility data justice. And it's a theme that's fairly new to me, and I don't have empirical data to present. You all, it looks like, have wonderful, rich empirical data in all of your PhD projects and other work you're doing. I'm going to be talking about a conceptual framework, which I've developed in collaboration with Frauke Behrendt, who's at Technical University of Eindhoven. And I'll actually be spending part of a sabbatical with her institution next year, where we'll be working on ethics in relation to mobility data justice and AI. So let me jump right into this. And the initial work that we did was just to begin to define what mobility data justice means. And what we were doing was trying to bring together my work on mobility justice from the book of 2018 with work on data justice and things like open data and thinking about data systems, and trying to think about, okay, what happens in this world in which mobility and data are co-occurring, co-constituted. So our questions began from what inequalities arise when mobility intersects with what others have called datafication. It's not a great word, but datafication, when you put data into everything, turn mobilities into data, and what are the specifics of the inequalities, taking the inequalities that already exist in our mobility systems and the inequalities that exist in data systems. So whose movement is captured and whose is overlooked in data collection and sharing, and what factors influence these inclusions and exclusions? And I know many of you are doing work that involves collecting data about mobility. And I hope as researchers, you're thinking very carefully about, like, okay, which data am I collecting? Which am I excluding? How am I defining the sort of categories of collection? Mobilities depend not only on the design of the built environment, but also on informational design. And as you, I'm sure, know, this mass mobile data collection is now rapidly being integrated with artificial intelligence and predictive algorithms. And so as we started this conceptual work, we then wanted to next think about how our algorithmic governance or management of mobilities coming into this existing platform of mobility and data inequities. So street design, infrastructural assemblages, data mobilities are the kind of infrastructural basis for this, but of course it ultimately combines with laws, regulations, and policies to shape the uneven terrain of mobilities and what we're thinking in particular about mobility transitions, like sustainable mobilities. And it's interesting that this transition towards sustainable mobilities is happening at this moment of datafication and of artificial intelligence being brought into the realm of governance of mobilities. So our argument is ultimately, and I have references at the end if you want to see where these publications are, planners, technologists, designers, regulators, and stakeholders should incorporate a mobility data justice perspective. Hence, it's lovely to be here to hope that you all begin to incorporate this. So that's the sort of summary of our initial arguments on this topic, and I'm going to try to expand on those today. So this is just an image pulled from the internet of, okay, what do people think of when they think of the sort of AI integrated, mobile, data-filled cities? And, you know, I ask you to look at this picture for a moment and think about, like, what's included and what's missing. What do you see and what do you not see? What is in the in our work on the new mobilities paradigm, we think very much about the imaginaries of mobility, not just the infrastructures, but the cultural meanings, the visual representations, how these circulate, how these generate different kinds of desires, plans, projects, investments. So this is the kind of image that is sold to urban planners. This actually comes from, you'll see a little, does this work? A little sign that says, oops, thinks on the left. Thinks AI is the AI company that this image was pulled from. And what I want to think about when I look at this is how, in the mobilities paradigm, we talk about how movement is socially and politically organized through infrastructures, and those infrastructures have frictions, rhythms, differentiated access, and so on. And so this is an image that I think is trying to portray, to a certain degree, a kind of smooth, uninterrupted flow of vehicles and of data simultaneously supporting each other in a sort of futuristic, high-rise urban setting. What you don't see, of course, is any bicycles. I don't see bicycles. I don't see, it's a very automobile and vehicle-dominated landscape. There are pedestrians and sidewalks and so on, but they're in a very commercialized space. So the public, what we might think of as public space in this kind of imagery, is reduced to a space of flows and shopping and commercial activity in some sense. There's no benches. Are there any benches? There's no benches, there's no, et cetera. So this is just like one example just to show the kinds of things we might think about in terms of the imaginaries of the future. So our article, Mobility Data Justice, it appears in the journal Mobilities, issue 18. I want to just say a little bit more about datafication and mobility and justice. And we're thinking about these physical affordances, socio-political affordances, imaginative and communicative and informational affordances for movement and mobilities, not just of people, but of vehicles, images, and information. And by affordances, we mean like what does that infrastructure and the environment and the shaping of space and the regulatory legal system, what does it allow for? What does it enable one to do or not do? So the access to and the effects of interdependencies of mobilities and data are not evenly distributed. So when we look at the kind of imaginative images, it's as if, okay, this will be for everybody, but of course, we know that that's unevenly distributed in terms of who will access it and who will not. There are invisible sort of softwares and remote controls that are built into this hybrid infrastructure, and that controls the circulation, the sorting, the surveillance, the rhythms, the disruptions, who can move smoothly or not. And just, I think about my journey on my way here. So I came first via, I've been in Italy for a week. I was at a conference in Bologna. And I had my family also traveled with me. My daughter just graduated from high school, so we took her for a trip to Bologna and Milan. And orchestrating that trip involved so many data mobilities to just be able to move. And this is from the position of what I would call a kinetic elite traveler. When I say kinetic elite, I mean the people who have easy access to information, to capital, to smartphones, to all the systems. And the amount of informational manipulation that goes into searching for bookings, getting the tickets, organizing the travel, getting the registration in the new European electronic system, EES, navigating the lines at the airport, the biometric data, the passports, the filling in a bunch of forms online, which you needed your phone to be able to fill in, and then when you arrive in the place, navigating the transportation system, the banks, the getting money, hotel reservations, opening door locks with your phone. I mean, I couldn't believe just like a simple family vacation involved so much organization of data. And every time, the point I want to make is every time we participate in those systems, we are helping build a system that is excluding others. We are part of the datafication of ourselves, of our lives, which leaves other people outside the datafication system. And also, if we ever want to escape the datafication of our lives, it's actually quite difficult to do. You realize how hard it would actually be to able to purchase anything, to move without having all of this in your phone, really, and your phone tracking you constantly. So datafication is now central to the governance and control of movement and the production of unequal mobilities. And when we speak of mobility data justice, what I want to do is talk in a little more detail about how AI is maybe coming into this. So now we're thinking about how being mobile involves this production, collection, and distribution of data, both consciously through our own actions, but also behind the scenes. So as I'm moving, my phone is tracking every step I take, every vehicle I ride on, every route, every connection to a cell phone tower, every connection to GPS, satellites. And so from our phones to ride-sharing apps to car sensors and diagnostic data that the car itself is collecting for insurance, ticketing apps for public transportation, geofencing if I want an urban bike or scooter to share, the use of my maps and GPS and fitness and wellbeing apps and traffic sensors, all of these are pouring in this informational infrastructure. And now, imagine all of that is now being fed into machine learning, and machine learning is then able to create generative artificial intelligence that can have a predictive effect on those mobilities. It can precede us and shape our next move. So unequal access to data, uneven production of data, and the absence from these data sets now emerges as crucial features of the uneven distribution of capabilities for potential movement or for stopping mobilities. And that leads to the following questions. So what happens when the algorithmic divide collides with the already existing injustices of inequitable mobility regimes? How do both together reshape the mobile and networked terrain of struggles for justice, what I have called mobility justice, but of course mobility justice involves things like climate justice, social justice, environmental justice. How is this algorithmic effect going to shape that? And how are bodies, infrastructures, cities, and mobility regimes caught up in and produced via these algorithmic inequities within the new horizons of automated artificial intelligence? And we're working on this chapter is going to be in a book co-edited by Anthony Elliott and Hideki Endo called Automated Horizons. So those are the kinds of key questions we're asking now. And so when it comes to data mobility justice or mobility data justice, and we can debate the order in which the words should arrive, we draw on the framework for different kinds of justice that I developed in my book, Mobility Justice, to think about specific kinds of justice. So distributive justice generally asks how access to mobility and data is unequally distributed, who benefits or is harmed by that distribution of access, and how can marginal groups perhaps reclaim control. So distributive justice, like, who gets to be part of this, who gets excluded, who is included in both mobility and data circulation and decision making. Procedural justice takes us to the level of the decision-making aspect, particularly who designs and controls mobility data infrastructures. And here we are starting to highlight the exclusionary role of AI and governance systems. So insofar as mobility was something that was seen as governed by sort of the state, regulating companies and what they did and creating the environment in which mobility happens, we now have data tech companies basically in a fight with governments, including local and city governments, as well as larger entities like the EU, for example, fighting over who has control now of the data and the circulation of data. And we see these kind of legal battles over who has access to those data flows, who has to pay for them, who are they considered corporate protected information, and in what ways are our public spaces and our public platforms are being captured in a way by corporate tech companies who take that data without paying for it and without giving it back to us. Those are some of the sort of procedural justice issues around what's happening right now. Epistemic justice asks about what counts as mobility-related knowledge. How do data systems shape inequalities, and how can alternative ways of knowing promote more fairness? And the epistemic question in work on mobility justice, it has to do with there's a critique of quantification and the way in which you've probably heard about the idea that in engineering streets, for example, they always used these certain quantified data measures of level of service, which told you how much traffic flow a street supported, and then streets were designed for that level of service to enable traffic flow. And the mobility justice argument was that excludes, cyclists and pedestrians, and they're not counted in the flow of traffic, and so you're actually engineering them out of the system by making them invisible in the data. And that if we began instead epistemically from our embodied experiences of moving in a city, what we see is some wonderful research that I'm sure some of you are probably involved in on, for example, carers' mobility, children's mobility. How do others who are moving in a city experience those streetscapes and those spaces? And it requires a different kind of epistemic thinking in terms of also how you as researchers measure that. How do you collect data on that? Where are you thinking from embodied experience rather than an engineering measurement? And then lastly, reparative justice asks who has already been harmed by or excluded from the existing mobility systems, and how might these new algorithmic and automated mobilities exacerbate those harms or maybe repair those harms? Can we think of using algorithmic governance in a way that is reparative, not always just causing more inequity or more harm? And so we think of these as different ways to think about mobility and data justice together. And so to summarize this work, mobility data justice is a multi-scalar, interdisciplinary approach for examining the entanglements of mobility and data with a social justice perspective. And it can focus on, at a minimum, distributive justice, procedural justice, and epistemic elements, as well as some of those others that I mentioned. So zeroing in a little bit more on artificial intelligence in relation to these questions means to think about how AI may be, and what we call algorithmic governance, might be deepening this kind of this entanglement of mobilities, datafication, automation, machine learning, and AI, both in terms of the questions of inclusion and exclusion. We're now looking not just at inclusion and exclusion in mobilities, but in automated data collection and sharing, and how those mobilities are enabled and restricted through applications of AI for automation. One of the key questions becomes what is being optimized for, and who's making that decision? Who makes the decision in AI systems of what they might be optimizing for, what they're measuring? And how are, as I said, access and ownership of mobility and data changing due to automation, including, for example, we see the rise of new kinds of transportation service providers. As transportation becomes this heavily datafied system, new kinds of businesses are emerging that then control the systems for mobilities and the kinds of vehicles we might have access to, or the routes or the rhythms of movement. And then what are the implications of turning mobility spaces, this kind of AI-formed street space and error space, what are the implications of turning that space into a resource with limited ownership, controlled access, and enclosure of the commons? And there's parallel work I'm doing on the idea of commoning and mobile commoning, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But just if we think about our ability to just move around, to walk, to ride a bike, whatever, as a kind of a commoning of space. There's space around us, and we think of ourselves as able to move through it. More and more of that space is now under the sort of algorithmic governance of these datafied mobility control systems. And so what does that mean as we lose the commons of mobility, as we are no longer able to just walk, ride, be somewhere, stop somewhere without being part of a datafied governance system. And so in the distributive perspective on this, we're asking about how mobility and data are accessed, accumulated, and distributed in unequal ways, how data and mobility infrastructures lead to inequitable risks and benefits. The governance of the systems can actually impose risks externally on those outside the system. Who is considered worthy of access to mobility data or to data mobilities, and who is targeted for data collection, surveillance, and control? And that's just one way to think about the distributive justice aspects. And I'm going to give a little bit of an example from some of Frauke's work on smart cycling. And this was a look at procedural perspectives on a smart cycling system and a bike share as an AI test bed. So using the data from Strata and public bike share systems to sort of think about the infrastructure design and the role of public institutions, private companies, and governance processes in co-producing a mobility data injustice, because this kind of mobility system captures certain kinds of riders and certain kinds of data and then leaves out many others. And so the question of who, how, and why decision-making and mobility are bound up with data algorithms and AI. And sorry, this slide is a little bit repetitive, so I'm going to move on to the epistemic perspective and what counts as data and knowledge in relation to mobility, and how different capabilities for mobilities are prevented or used. And the example I want to just end up with here has to do with thinking about how algorithmic governance is embedded into infrastructures that are not just about corporate control. And we often think of platform systems as increasingly automated. So platform mobilities, networked mobility systems, the control of, for example, drivers in the gig economy, bike delivery riders and truck drivers and all of those. We know that there's the use of AI to allocate tasks, to monitor performance, to evaluate workers, to distribute sanctions and rewards. And there's been a lot of research happening on the ways in which labor is being controlled in these systems. And I think it's important to also match that sense of private corporate control with the sense that the governance of those systems is already embedded in an existing state or government-controlled mobility infrastructure. So the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, the data infrastructure, the systems of law, rules, and regulations, those have already created the affordances of the socio-technical system through which circulation is happening. So there's an information environment, and companies and states together are shaping this technical and normative environment for circulation, making it calculable, making it legible, making conduct becomes anticipatory as, in a sort of Foucauldian sense, as people embody this governmentality of the mobility system. Okay, so we have the state-created infrastructures of counting and policy and law and regulation, and then we have companies moving in to utilize that. So within that, there's an unequal distribution of different kinds of visibility and responsibility. And what appears as objective data collection at any point in time is always embedded in that already existing infrastructure of selection of what counts. So what counts is open to contestation. And I think the key argument I want to sort of end on is that what counts now is difficult to locate as far as a political contestation. Oops, did that just? How are all mobilities, if they're embedded in infrastructures of algorithmic governance, how do we locate where it can be contested if there is a question of injustice? Will we even be able to identify a locus of power, a legal jurisdiction, when decision-making is automated and is happening somewhere in between the state and the corporate providers of mobility infrastructures? And where would deliberative justice or procedural justice, where would it even happen? Where would be the legal territory for contesting power within such systems? And how does the control of mobility datafication, how does it cross scales, cross data fields, cross like fields of different kinds of data? It becomes this kind of complex web of intersecting mobilities and datafication. So ultimately, we're calling for the need to explore who participates in decision-making and the design of infrastructure, and where will that happen, and consider a wide range of infrastructures relevant to mobility data justices and injustice. So it's not just the particular company or a particular mobility system or a particular kind of vehicle or even a single city, but it's the design system, the economic and policy processes around them, who participates, what is the role of public institutions, of private companies, of governance processes in co-producing mobility data injustices. Consider the who, the how, and the why of decision-making around mobility as being intrinsically bound up with algorithms and artificial intelligence, which is increasingly black boxing how crucial decisions are reached. It's leaving people out of the loop to a greater extent than ever before, which undermines the very notion of procedural justice. To explore what counts as data and knowledge in relation to mobility and how it is applied to knowing the world must include considerations of how data systems are implicated in the production of these intersectional immobilities and mobilities at intersections of the traditional means of mobility injustice, which include age, gender, race, sexuality, class, and disabilities. And those are all now being intensified in new ways that distribute responsibility, authority, and decision-making in shaping our ability to collectively intervene in these, what I call kino-political systems. How do we contest the frictions, the rhythms, the distributions, the pauses, and the disruptions? And how might infrastructural commoning allow for a new kind of more equitably governed algorithmic mobility data justice system. And I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there, and there's a few of the references from some of this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mimi, for a super exciting presentation. You're not out of time, I guess, or you were not, but we wanted to be yes, we wanted to be reserving time for discussion.
Absolutely.
So any comments, thoughts? Yes. And again, as yesterday, so wait for the mic and introduce yourself so that people know who's making the question.
Hey, I'm Harvey Miller from The Ohio State University. Thank you for a very thought-provoking keynote. I've always liked your term kinetic elites, by the way. I've been using that in my teaching. I teach a sustainable transportation course. My students hear that term all the time, so it's great. What I'm wondering is, it seems like we've switched one type of overlord for another type of overlord, or one type of black box for another type of black box in mobility and data. Your example of travel. You basically had to deal with datafication. You had to deal with whatever system you're dealing with. But in the old days, I would have to contact a travel agent, who would shape what choices were given to me for reasons that may not be apparent, might be profit on their part. Also, when it comes to planning, in the old days, we had to rely upon technical elites who told us, well, here's the different choices we have here. Now we're in, a post-fact era where everyone brings their own data and own facts to the table, and we never resolve, like, who's right, who's wrong. So I'm just wondering, what's the solution here? It seems like we've just switched new bosses for old bosses. So how do we go forward with this?
Yeah, and first I want to agree that all of this can be historicized. That is to say, it's not totally new that we're suddenly in this problematic situation, right? It's always existed in different forms and has changed over time. And in fact, in my own work, I always go back to my work coming out of the field of Atlantic world and Caribbean studies and the post-slavery emancipation transitions, which in those historical eras were heavily datafied, right? There are archives that I use as a historical sociologist that are full of data of ships' logs, of people being treated as commodities and recorded and bought and sold, and goods moving, and plantation records, and there was a huge datafication of mobility, let's just say, in the plantation era. So that part of it is not new. And of course, there was also private actors and businesses, and there was public regulation, and taxation also being an important part of why datafication occurs. And so I think when you said are we just trading one overlord for another, I mean, there is a debate, that occurs in the media that's very against these companies and the companies as the tech billionaire overlords who are now running the world. But I think as we've been working on this idea of algorithmic governance and what's happening with mobility data systems is that it's, as I was saying, it's both the companies and it's the state, so it's public and private. And what that means in a kind of Habermasian type perspective, right, is that there's a third entity. There's a civil society in the middle of the state and the market. And in that kind of third space is where life occurs, reproductive work occurs, and commoning occurs, commons. And so I think that's where politically debates about data commons, open platforms, mobility as a commons becomes relevant for me as what do we do next, is that we reclaim that space. We make space for that, which is to say we place limits on companies and we place democratic controls on states so that there's a space of governance in which a more livable and equitable social commoning can occur. which preserves some degree of respect for marginalized groups and reparative justice and efforts towards, I guess, more of a participatory and procedural systems of justice within that realm of mobility and data. I don't know if that answers the question.
Excellent. Further questions? Yes, in the middle.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Martin Haamer from the University of Tartu, and I was wondering that in the context of mobility data justice, what are your thoughts on the push towards mobility as a service? That is it perhaps even good that it's taken more time and that there have been some experiments on implementing this approach, that we can have a bit more thought on how this affects different people and from the data perspective side?
Yeah, so I mean, mobility as a service is a large realm of many, many different services these days. And one of the concerns that from a mobility justice perspective and data justice perspective is whether as mobility as a service, as we see it implemented, it seems to have very uneven effects in terms of who can access it and which areas of cities have those services. And of course, there's many efforts to think about, I mean, going back to the very early days of like bike share systems, you know, of like, well, okay, where are they located? Where are the stations? If you have to park them in a certain place once you're done using them, how equitable is the distribution of that? Does that create new inequities? I mean, I think that kind of question has been there from the beginning. And in terms of the mobility as a service, in terms of the platform transportation networks, first of all, there's a huge battle over the labor involved. So the drivers, are the drivers working for a company? Are they independent contractors? They're unionizing, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time now that the companies are increasingly looking towards automated vehicles. So mobility as a service is becoming, the company reaction is, first of all, to push the drivers into independent contractors, then to use the software to control the conditions of work, basically, with unequal visibility into, you know, the price that is being offered and the price the worker gets paid. And now, as those workers unionize and try to take back some control over that, the shift will be to automated vehicles, which will just cut out the workers altogether and solve the labor question through automation. So we're already seeing in the US, you know, Waymo and automated taxi systems are being rolled out in many cities. And people are angry about that. And we actually use an image in the article of a riot that occurred and Waymos were attacked and burned and, you know, bonfire of the automated vehicles. So these are areas of huge, like, political contestation in terms of how mobility as a service will move forward in the future.
Yes, let's have from there. Sorry. Okay, I had here in front, I think, was the first one. Yes.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I'm Mari Päätalo from the city of Espoo, Finland. And I have kind of impossible question for you, because when social media started, we were really positive, like this is winning of democracy and this will bring new things, our life and everything will be better. And now I'm looking around, we don't have much optimism, we don't have a vision, how could we, now we have that much data, like things are possible that were never before. But somehow, how could we like have kind of John Lennon imagine all the people and data? It has been said that data is new oil. And how could we use that for the better world, and what could be done? Because we had plenty of questions and plenty of worries, but how could we bring this to some new vision? Sorry about this impossible question.
Yeah, I mean, in my recent work, I've been turning to some of the work on feminist mobility studies on care work and caring, and I see that as the idea of careful mobilities as one place in which we can think both about like care for the environment, like what does it mean to be more careful in how we move, and to limit our mobilities, to place limits on ourselves, to be more thoughtful of others. And of course, that's natural in a way to humans. Like when we walk and there's other people there, we don't bump into each other. We don't just like barrel through. We take notice and we adjust and we be careful, or we slow down and so on. In all of our mobilities, we should recognize that we're social and caring people, and can think not just of humans, but of more than humans, of mobilities of other creatures, plants, living things, the atmosphere. So that's number one. And then number two, from a sort of social justice perspective and thinking about other inequities around gender, disabilities, aging bodies, and so on, we also care for others. We are mobile with others. Generally, people become mobile starting as children, like with some adult helping them be mobile, carrying them, pushing them. And so our sort of introduction into mobilities involves relationships. So I think of relational mobilities and caring mobilities, and then all of the work of unpaid work of reproduction, but also of play and enjoyment. So if we take that kind of perspective on thinking about what kind of world do we imagine in the future, technology, social media, I mean, technology has always been there. There's always been different technologies. Technologies are different kinds of ways we do things in the world. So I don't blame the technology or the social media per se, but I think if we step out of our individualistic, kind of competitive, sort of getting ahead, economic man sort of view of the world, maybe we can use social media technologies for more relational and caring mobilities as well.
Thank you so much. There was the back, was it with you who I pointed the last time? And I think we have a couple of minutes left, so we can do brief questions.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Karen Corrientes Velasco, and I'm studying in Ghent University and also in Leuven. I'm very happy to be present at this chat because also I'm using your mobility justice conceptual framework for my presentation there today. So this is very, very nice to see. And my question is related to one of the courses, to one of the courses that will be happening later in the EIT schedule for next week. And there will be this qualitative methodologies course, and there is some part of this that will also be taking into account the use of AI in qualitative methodologies. And I would like to know your thoughts of this. This is also an impossible question, how to overcome epistemic injustice. And is there a way in which you think that we will be able to overcome the injustices that are not only reproduced but exacerbated by these new opportunities that are present because of AI?
Yeah. So this is a great topic of debate at many universities now in teaching ethical AI. So for example, I'm at a Polytechnic University. All of our students are basically science, technology, engineering kind of students, but they go through a humanities and a social science program of project-based learning, where we actually do projects with local community organizations around the world. And one of the questions we've asked about that is, okay, these are the research, the students, the next generation of computer scientists and engineers and so on, they are going to be making this technology and this world of AI. Like that's their trajectory of this generation. So I would like them to learn to think ethically about what they're doing. And given that we have this chance to give them a little bit of social science and humanistic training as part of their degrees, what can we do with that? And so our thinking was like that through project-based learning, what they're doing is they are co-producing and co-designing projects with organizations out there around the world, different cultures, different languages in different countries. We're in 34 different countries with 1,200 students traveling each year, and they work in teams of 4 with a project sponsor and a faculty advisor. And so hopefully they can take their technology, which can involve AI as well as other technologies, use it with participants to think about what problem do they need solved, what problem are they working on, and what kind of data collection and what kind of data analysis can they work on with these other people, who many of whom are, from different kinds of social backgrounds and experiences and problems that they're facing, and get their input as they're designing the project. Get their input as they're asking the questions, get their input as they're collecting the data, get their input as they're analyzing the data. And so we're teaching the students to do that, but we hope that researchers would be doing that, but also that the technologists, once they go off to work for the companies making the technology, will also then be thinking in that way of what does it mean to sort of co-design something with people and to try to do it ethically and responsibly and responsively.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mimi, for the answers to the questions. I think that in the interest of time, we have to be closing the session now. I saw that there were many hands up still, so please do continue the discussion amongst yourselves and then with Mimi on the breaks. And thanks once more for the thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you.
A big applause.
Thank you.